The panel we have in front of us, as I said, you know most of them, but the person you may or may not know, and I know some of you do, is Ken Dorph here, just to my left.
Hello.
And we welcome him from Sag Harbor, and he'll tell you a little bit more about what he does, but if he looks familiar to you, I know he spoke here a couple years ago on the Middle East, so some of you may remember him from that. Todd French, our very own. Ralph Abraham, one of our founding mentors. William Irwin Thompson, one of our founding mentors. Carrie Clark. And the new guy, Jim Pickett. Jim will serve as the moderator of this panel, so he has a job here, too, as the new guy. We'll be spending about, as I started to say, 5 minutes for each panelist to talk. Then we have some discussion questions that we will seed a discussion with. And then at the end, we have ample time for question and answer for you all to get involved. So if you have questions you want to ask, jot them down, because it may be that we are, at the end of the panel, then having opportunity to talk about those. I wanted to talk a little bit, too, about the day we have today, because we have this panel here this morning, and then we have another speaker this afternoon. So this day is a little different. We've gotten into kind of a flow with a speaker in the morning and then breakout discussions. This day may feel a little longer. It'll feel a little different, and it's good to have some change, so it'll break up the routine. But the speaker this afternoon, and I'll do a formal introduction of him this afternoon, but it's Michael Mendenhall, and he's talking to us about trends in some data. And so this panel's talking about trade, and this afternoon we're talking about trends. And so I just wanted to think a little bit this morning about what is a thread, and make sure that we know what we mean by thread, and then to know, just to comment a bit about trend. So threads is a really specific word in the Ross lexicon. And for those of you who are new, we actually do have a Ross lexicon, and we're trying to find it to post on the Blackboard site. We will find it, we'll be successful. But the idea of thread is something that we use the word specifically at Ross. And so I'm going to ask my audience here, my colleagues, does anybody want to give us some insights about what a thread is, or how you relate to the word thread when you think about the curriculum? Go ahead, Deborah. Sorry, microphone. I'm sorry. I'm throwing this at you guys, and I didn't tell you I was going to do this. I didn't know I was going to do this.
For me, it's a theme or a topic that endures over time.
Okay.
That can be studied over time.
Do you have an example?
Architecture, governance.
Okay.
Let me see what else. Trade.
Trade, okay. Anybody else have ideas about a thread in the Ross curriculum that is a different way of thinking of it, or building on Deborah's idea? Right up here, Deborah. Elka, right in front of you.
Is it? Oh, it is. At the lower school, we've been talking more about, and maybe it's the same thing, but commonalities that evolve through the spiral. So, because we're starting at the very bottom of the spiral, so we've just come in contact with things like the elemental forces and how they seem to weave through and evolve through the curriculum as we go forward.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so I'll summarize just briefly. I'm hearing that it's possibly an idea, concept that's present throughout a significant part of the spiral, so it's present through over the time that we have in the spiral. And so we have some good examples. The one that often comes up that we didn't mention was archaeoastronomy, comes up a lot. But trade is the one we're talking about today as threads. And then just to contrast that a little bit or compare it with trend, this afternoon, Michael Mendenhall is going to talk about database trends that he has seen, that he's actually studied worldwide trends. And so the trend being a general tendency that's extending in a particular direction, so it's allowing us to look at something. But it's different than the way we use thread. So I just wanted to point that out, that that's my connection of how the two parts of the day are fitting together, aside from just the themes and the pieces people are talking about. So the only other thing I wanted to say about our long and different day today is to let you know, to remind you that we have a wine and cheese reception at the end of the day, and I thought that was worth noting too. So without further delay, I wanted to turn this over to the panel, and we have a sort of an order of, Jim, are you remembering that? Okay, perfect. All right, I will let you proceed. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to go ahead and start with Bill.
That's my introduction to go?
That's your introduction to go. I can
Okay.
introduce you again if you'd like.
No.
Okay.
I've been here for 16 years. So, a thread for me is an artistic metaphor for something you musicians might think of in terms of Wagnerian leitmotif, that it, when it comes and it repeats in a spiral, it echoes with all the previous encounters that the student may have had, like gender relationships or matristic cultures in the lower school, and then feminism and Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, in the 10th and 11th grade. And so as these musical themes are woven into complexity, if you hear the Siegfried theme, then it's blended into others. And so it moves into this pattern that we saw with Kurt Fischer's, that the 12th grade is moving to a conscious level of cognitive mapping and can begin to see the kind of narrative metastructures that have governed the sort of developmental pattern of the curriculum as a whole. Now, in dealing with the thread, I myself started my professional career teaching humanities at MIT in the 60s, which was the Vietnam War and was the triumph of econometrics, and Samuelson was our god at MIT. I've never had a course in economics. I majored in anthropology, philosophy, and English literature, so I satisfied my social science requirements by escaping economics. And that's because I don't have Ralph's mind in the multiple intelligence. I have the verbal linguistic mind and not the algorithmic kind of mind. So I resist what actually has been the spirit of the age, because if you can create an algorithm for the behavior of markets, then you get the Bank of Stockholm so-called Nobel Prize, but isn't really a Nobel Prize. This is told to me by Ralph and the economist Hazel Henderson. And that's the way the world is going. But from a biological or a cultural point of view, markets are deeply embedded into human transactions. And many times the abstraction that is introduced abstracts out from the system everything that's important and of value. So I attempted to start with the phenomenology of the formation of the self with the infant, nursing at the breast of his mother, as described in Wordsworth's autobiographical poem, The Prelude, in which the mother is humming and singing a lullaby, and the bonding of infant and mother is heard by the infant along with the babble of the river Derwent. And so he's embedded in an ecosystem in nature and the mother, and it's a whole saturation of relationship and value. So the formation of an I is automatically at its beginning and emergence a we that's being performed. So these things, you have to think in terms of culture. Now, one of the difficulties with, say, the rise of Tea Partyism and libertarianism, which is a kind of 19th century, 18th century Newtonian mechanical model of space is empty and objects are in it, and there are objects and agents. Agents are exchanging objects, and they can entirely ignore the space that's there because space is empty. And so you just simply dump your stuff into the river, you dump your stuff in the air, and when you apply an industrial mentality to ecological relationships, you say, well, this is just a market operating and we can cap and trade. I'll give you some of my pollution if you give me some of your pollution. That's never going to solve the environmental planetary crisis. You have to think in terms of planetary dynamics, and in Ralph's complex dynamical systems, that space is not empty, that it's a landscape of mountains and valleys, basins of attraction, and that they're both mutually co-determining, and there are these floating attractors that are constantly moving in the basin where this energy like a watershed is going. So space around it is dynamic. You have to think of the environment and the whole complexity. So immediately I was trying to put our cultural phenomenology. I've always said for years We're not teaching cultural history, which is a list of facts and dates. We are teaching cultural phenomenology and the dynamics of cultural development matched to the level of the cultural dynamic of the growth and evolution of the consciousness of the child. So we don't want to take an econometric algorithm and start doing it in kindergarten and saying, hey, we're really advanced at Ross. We've got the kids doing econometrics in kindergarten. That's a pathological mentality, and it creates damage. Most of my white paper is like a caveat. Beware of certain kind of traps that are there. Now, in the new thinking, it used to be Darwinian struggle of the survival. But my colleague in the Lindisfarne Association, Lynn Margulis, the biologist of UMass Amherst, has created an evolutionary theory of acquired genomes and symbiosis, and the whole development is a different narrative of evolution that is very much a kind of we narrative rather than competing I's. So we are experiencing paradigm shifts in all the sciences. There's network theory applied to neurons and synapses. There is dark energy influencing the formation of galaxies and creating a different dynamic of subspace. There's a whole new economics, bioeconomics, that I think is emerging and that will learn from biology and will learn from neuroscience and will learn from Ralph's complex dynamical systems. So we can apply this to how we teach, because it's very true that trade is not just something that pops up in the 9th grade. It's basic to the formation of human consciousness and goes all the way back. So we can do it from K through 12, but how we do it has to be sensitive to the embeddedness of value in culture and human relationships. So I've tried to show through all the grades in the document where this thread comes up and how formative it can be. I was greatly influenced as an anthropology student, Todd, by reading a very classic paper by Lewiston Sharp called Steel Axes for Stone Age Australians. Now, some of you may know that the Australians live in a symbolically encoded landscape of both the relationship of hyperdimensions called the dreamland and the ancestral time, and they do their walkabout through what are called song lines, in which they perform the myths and relate to the landscape, and they exchange axes. And the exchange of axes is an extremely important way of performing the network and reestablishing love and bonds and relationships. And how the axe is formed from the landscape as the stone axe, how it's exchanged, how it circulates, all of this is a performance of their culture. The Europeans came in and just gave them steel axes, and they were so efficient and they absolutely destroyed the whole network. Now, in another culture with the Kwakiutl, when they gave them steel axes, there was an efflorescence of totem pole culture, because they could cut faster and deeper and higher. But the highest totem poles come at the death of the totem pole culture. It's a sunset effect. So in one culture, you have a kind of artistic efflorescence coming from cultural exchange, but in the other, it just shuts it down, because there was no sensitivity to the gender relationships of exchange of axes and the rest of it. So understanding the phenomenology of culture and how it affects is like moving away from Newtonian space with objects and agents and market exchanges to seeing the space as dynamic as dark energy is around the stars, or seeing how glial cells in the brain, which we don't really understand anything, but they're extremely important, and it's the cutting edge of biology right now. Glial cells affect the formation of the synapse, and they're sort of governing and modeling it. So there's a whole substructure where we concentrate on neurons and synapse and axons and dendrites. There's a whole other structure that are the glial cells, which are analogous to the dark energy in, in space. Now, if you notice what I've just done, I've been laying beside you various kind of images. The image of space, the image of synapse, the image of markets. And moving to a meta level in which those are all isomorphic and are performing a kind of common complex dynamical system. So when we teach, if we try to teach everything, and we'll get lost in data and we'll have an information catastrophe and implode, but if we jump up to the higher level and we see the cultural phenomenology, and we see the dynamical system, then we can simplify our narrative and begin to present it encoded in storytelling to the kids. So this offers us a whole new way of expanding our narrative and not just focusing on objects of art. End of sermon.
Thanks, Bill. That's actually very informative. For those of you who may not have read that paper yet, by the way, this actually provides, I think, a very nice outline. Todd, your turn.
Well, I'm going to emphasize a lot of the stuff that Bill has already talked about. As an anthropologist, I was just thinking how nice it is to sit on a panel where I feel at home, and an economics panel where I feel somewhat at home, instead of coming out from left field, which is usually where the anthropologist comes from. And when I was trained as an undergraduate, it was at a place where the business school sort of collected Nobel Prizes in economics, and in particular, how to apply economics to all kinds of things like the relationship between parents and children. And the anthropology department actually faced the business school, and we sort of imagined trenches running in between them, much like in World War I and II. So one of the things that I really enjoyed about Bill's paper is the opening statement that trade is basic to the development of the human brain and culture. And I think that is absolutely crucial thing that we can teach to our kids, but maybe not in the way that an economist might argue that trade is basic to human culture. An economic anthropologist named Marcel Mauss made the argument that trade is what he called a total social phenomenon, meaning that trade is, like all of economic behavior and thought, embedded within a cultural system, and in particular, a moral and a political system. And I'll talk about how a little, when 1776 rolls around and Wealth of Nations is written by Adam Smith, that the whole movement of the discipline of economics has been to, in a sense, separate out economic behavior from that cultural, moral, and political context, and to treat it as if it's a science that we can investigate, all else being equal, right, and sort of taking that away. And I know that, there's, as Ken will probably say, that there's been a movement to reinsert those things back into economics. So I think one of the things that we can teach to kids about economics, and that comes out really clearly in this thread, is the embeddedness of economic behavior and thought within larger cultural contexts. And if we think about the current or the recent subprime mortgage crisis, one of the things that I've always thought is that components of it, such as mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, would look completely ridiculous and also outrageous from the point of view of a Song Dynasty merchant or a Swahili trader, right? That those sort of things, having a moral obligation that is monetized, abstracted, tranched, cut up into different parts, and then sold outside of the social relationships in which that debt or that obligation was founded, would seem really ridiculous from other cultural points of view and other historical points of view. And anthropologists and European colonists and traders, of the last century and the century before, when they started going out and contacting other cultures, realized the relativity of economic behavior when they went to places like the Trobriand Islands, just north of Papua New Guinea. And they found that men in the Trobriand Islands would spend all year accumulating wealth, doing all kinds of ceremonies, preparing themselves, being obsessed in the same way that a New York stock trader would be obsessed with checking their crackberry every hour to check the stock market. Trobriand Islanders would spend years just preparing for these annual ceremonial exchanges called the Cooler Ring, where they would sort of gather up a whole bunch of wealth, tradable goods, but also these shell necklaces and armbands that had no monetary value. They weren't really money because they didn't operate according, their value was not set according to the supply or law of supply and demand. That is, anyone could pick up shells off the beach and make these things. But then they would go out on these, big ocean-going, very dangerous voyages to the next island, where they trade, a necklace for an armband in a very prescribed way. And the idea of doing these voyages and going through all this trouble to trade shell necklaces and armbands seemed ridiculous to European colonists and to anthropologists when they first encountered it. Likewise, among the Curricular Indians that Bill cited, ceremonial feasts called potlatches, which were competitive feasts between chiefs, in which chiefs would spend all year calling in debts and obligations and building up wealth, primarily in the form of blankets that had been traded by sort of the European trading companies, and copper shields, which were indigenously crafted shields that were a form of currency or a store of value. But they would spend all year sort of collecting these things, and then at a big lavish feast, they would go about giving it all away. In fact, giving it away in such ostentatiously elaborate ceremonies that some of them would actually break these copper shields, which should be like ripping up a Ben Franklin, and throwing them into the ocean. And again, Europeans, when they saw these sort of exchanges, which we would call trade, they made absolutely no sense from a European perspective. And so when anthropologists started to try and understand the cultural logic behind potlatch ceremonies and cooler ring exchanges, which seemed ridiculous in terms of the what Adam Smith said was the goal of all economics, which is to sort of maximize a good, didn't make sense because they were giving that good away. They were just sort of getting rid of it, or trading things that seemed to have no monetary value. And we term these things gift economies and realized that the point of trade was not to accumulate wealth, but was actually to build social relationships, right? Gift exchange, the primary function of gift exchange was to either build, create, manipulate, or actually destroy a social relationship through the reciprocal exchange of goods, right? Something of value. And the reason why that works is because of a moral obligation to reciprocate that which is given, which over time, if A gives a gift to B, B is then in debt to A until he repays it, and then that sort of cycle goes on until there's a social relationship that's built on moral obligation, okay? Come back to the subprime mortgage crisis and realize that these moral obligations, and that's what debt really is. It's a moral obligation. So if we go back to the banks of It's a Wonderful Life, the savings and loan industry was giving out a loan to someone to build a house, but it was embedded within a social relationship, right? That George knew Mr. Martini, right, and had a relationship that lasted for a long period of time. So trade, that makes sense in terms of this thing that we call exchange, right, which is not only embedded with but constitutes social relationships. And the way that moral obligation, that debt has been monetized and abstracted and cut up and separated out from moral relationships and social relationships is one of the things I think we have to help students understand, right? How is it that a moral obligation such as debt can become so abstract that you can sort of buy and sell it without even know who the debtor is and really who the originating creditor was. So what I would argue for is a metacognitive awareness of the discipline of economics and how economics, the way that it has traditionally developed, is a product of the 18th century Enlightenment. and the idea that all human beings universally are rational economizers, I think we're starting to chip away at that idea that all human beings are rational in their economic decisions, right? No matter how complex the models are, because the latest market crisis just doesn't bear that out. And to really say, what can we understand in world history using the analytical categories of economics, and what is beyond that? Does it make sense to talk about the cowrie shells that were traded between Çatalhöyük and Jericho as a form of money, right? Rather than what Bill terms them as instrumentalities of value, which I think is a much more apt phrase, because it asks a question: where does the value of these things come from if it's not the golden law of supply and demand? So to have that sort of that metacognitive awareness that economics is a particular discipline that arose in a particular historical context and may not capture the lived reality of trade and exchange between individuals and groups.
We're developing lots of topics for conversation as we move on here. Ken, I'd like you to go next, and maybe you can just give a very quick background statement for folks who don't know you in the audience.
Well, actually, I'm going to give a fairly detailed background
Well, that's
statement
even better.
Because, well, for two reasons. One is that you don't know me well, and I also do not really know much the Ross curriculum, so to speak to it in that way, I think for me to share with you more my evolution in terms of both the word economics and the concepts and also trade would be more useful. And I think part of that comes from my own personal experience, which I'd like to talk about. First, to begin, I'm from a very working class, leftist, intellectual New York City background. My parents were kind of commie types. And in one of those housing project neighborhoods, which are still common in places like Rome and Mexico City, but seem to have disappeared in the United States, of real working class intellectuals. And that really imbued a sense of awareness of economic power and differences, because my parents were very conscious of that. In fact, I was born the day that Julius and Rosenberg were not assassinated, were executed. Oh, that's my father's prejudice speaking. so that was a slip of the tongue. I was always a very good student. I went to a science high school in New York City, and my focus was really biology and evolution. That always fascinated me, and that is a thread that continued through my life, very much looking at evolution, because I see evolution as closely related to economics, as I saw it later on. When I went to college, I switched to anthropology, which I'm very grateful for. It didn't seem very practical at the time, but it was certainly useful in later going, especially into the many cultures I've lived in, because it gave me tools. But one of the struggles I had with anthropology is I was always someone who saw commonalities rather than differences. It's my personality. So when people were looking for differences, I was saying, well, wait a minute, but we're the same here, here, and here. And that's part of the reason I left anthropology, is because it was who I am. I didn't really care about the differences. I wanted to find how we were the same, because I'm very much a humanist in my philosophy and also my personality. I had my junior year, I had a wonderful Mediterranean studies program where it was focusing on the entire Mediterranean basin. I lived in Malta, Venice, and Morocco. And in each of them, the papers I wrote, in a sense, and I didn't realize at the time, were economic, and thinking about how things worked. In Malta, I did a little paper on the economics and geography of gender, where men and women each went and why and how and what, which was, for someone who was 19, it was a pretty fascinating topic. And then in Morocco, I looked at the markets. In Morocco, they have, Souk al-Khamis and Souk al-Arba, all these different markets and how they formed and how the geography of the markets, which was also fascinating, why people traded what they traded. And then in Venice, I looked at the history of Venice and the Middle East and learned that Venice was a backwater in Roman times, but because they had salt, that's all they had were salt pans, they became traders, and that trading evolved with the whole Adriatic and eventually the funduks of Syria and Lebanon. And that knowledge of the Mediterranean and all of the trade routes of the Mediterranean was something that really was a basis for thinking later on, especially as I got involved in the Middle East. I was really fascinated by Morocco, fell in love with Morocco, found that I was good in languages, which as a science student I had no idea, and learned Arabic, and then ended up working. I had a Peace Corps in Tunisia, where I really learned Arabic and French, and then I had a Fulbright in Damascus and spent some time there. So my fascination turned to the Middle East. Now, I got practical. I realized I was looking around all the other graduate students, and all of them had wealthy parents, and I didn't. And I would never have the down payment for the house. So I decided I wanted to do something practical with this, and I went to business school. Now, you have to realize, from my background, business students were like the horror people. And that I had no idea what they did in the World Trade Center as it was being built, because that was not my world. But going to Wharton, which was a great school, was an incredible revelation for me on so many levels. One was the study of economics and finance, which really was eye-opening. The other was the people. I found there were extroverts like myself. There were people who wanted to get things done. And I have learned to feel much more, not pro-business is not the word, because I know probably more than the average person the downside and the negatives of concentrations of wealth and information asymmetry, but I also like the purity of it. I love the fact that Middle East, the people who were doing business, were making, I love the local commercial guy. I love the trader. I love the people who were making the deals, because they were just pure. It wasn't about left or right or politics. It was a pure and wonderful world. And perhaps I went a little bit too Thatcherite for a period of time. My family was horrified. And but eventually I pulled back. My first job was with Citibank, and the reason I joined it was because it was the ultimate transactional bank. Citibank, if any of the history of the American banking system, the other banks, Chase and Bank of America, all were family banks and very blue blood, but Citibank was not. It was a collection of small Dutch banks, First National City, and therefore was, before it was destroyed in the 90s by the investment bankers, which is another story, was truly a meritocratic bank. It was the Puerto Rican secretary could become a vice president, because that's the way, and I loved it. It was real New York. I'm a total New Yorker. And I loved, and I worked in Cairo, I worked in the Middle East, so it was a great, great experience. Really began to understand finance in different levels. Went on to Smith Barney in the investment banking world, which is a whole other story, but was in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, so really got to understand the oil economies, wealth, and investing. And then woke up and realized that I was not meant to be in that world, and I was really a little bit too intellectual, so I became a consultant. The last 20 years I've been a consultant, starting with Booz Allen. And I think of consulting as very, very similar to teaching. Slightly higher pay because it's grown-ups that you're teaching, but very, very similar. You're really teaching and sharing and moving idea to idea. I haven't probably read a book in 20 years. It's mainly presentations and articles and discussions. And my consulting has primarily been either in financial institutions, helping a bank, mainly outside the United States, improve its risk management, its marketing, et cetera, or in financial systems. And I think this is part of the topic today. I know quite a lot about financial systems. I like to think that in a presentation I actually predicted the mortgage crisis about 6 months before it happened. I have worked a lot with the World Bank, and I actually was with the World Bank briefly. That's another side career. I work a lot with helping to fix, as much as one can, financial systems in distress. I was in Mexico during the peso crisis, in Southeast Asia during that crisis, Indonesia, Thailand. So I see a lot about how financial systems work, both well and not. And we'll talk about that later, because I have strong feelings about the good and the bad of financial systems. Because to me, talking about economics or finance is like good or bad. It's like talking about politics or religion as good or bad. They are fundamental to human existence. And I see that more and more. I was trying to time this, and I just realized I didn't hit the button. So tell me if I'm at 5 minutes.
You're well past 5 minutes.
It is? Okay, I'll be real fast. What I want to finish with is, when I was in college, the only economics course I remember from high school, I was in a New York City high school, was talking about closed shops and open shops, and also how to write a check. And I think because in those days we were all being prepared to be workers, that's all we really needed to know. And then in college, I'd see these boring, horrible business students carrying accounting books and microeconomics, and it just sounded so, I was studying African dance and cool things, so it just sounded so horrible and boring. Then when I went to Wharton and I took economics courses, I found them intellectually liberating and fascinating. And how I see it, and I'm going to, this will be part of the conversation, is, first of all, I'll leave you with definitions. The first definition in Merriam-Webster of economics, which I looked up, is a social science concerned chiefly with description analysis of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Now, does that sound boring or what? I would put me to sleep. Okay, now that's not the definition I learned in business school. Not at all. It was completely different. So I said, why did I learn different and think of it differently? So I looked up and I found Investopedia, which I like very much for finance. Investopedia is one of my favorite sources for financial terms. Gave the definition that I understand, and it is a social science that studies how individuals, governments, firms, and nations make choices on allocating scarce resources to satisfy their unlimited wants. Unlimited wants, like 3-year-olds, you know what I mean? It's a great word. I love that definition because it also aligns a lot with what my colleagues here are talking about. I think it's rooted in the basis of human evolution and competition. You know, and I see economic, when someone says, for example, marriage is an economic contract, you know, the same-sex marriage, people think of taxes. No, I see it on a level of evolution. When a straight man looks at a woman's body shape, he's thinking of his cheap sperm. She has expensive eggs. And I see it this way. I see it economically. So she has a very different view of how she's going to make this decision. No, but this is really, economics is fundamental in human evolution of how we make our choices on the individual level and then on the social level, because I want the gene pool of the tribe to survive. It goes down to that micro level, and it carries all the way up to complex human societies. And just a final example on this. We have 2 10-year-olds, and we have created a very lovely circle of friends, and Michelle's one of them, who you trust them with your kids. And I see this as loving and good and spiritual, but really, it's an economic investment. And the utilitarian in me that understands this knows, even though these are all good people, that when I take Amy's kids for the 3 days, I know that we're doing a little bank here. And this is part of the social contract that we're fulfilling, is the economic investment in the future return. Now, it sounds very, I don't know, utilitarian, but it's true. Like it or not, it is true. And economics underlines all of our decision making. That's all I'm going to say for now, but we can continue on larger levels.
I think we will want to. Carrie.
Okay,
your
I'm next.
turn.
All right, I'm coming to this panel for 2 reasons, or 2 things bring me here that are related to my work at the school and also related to stuff I do outside of the school. First of all, you guys, a lot of you probably know that I teach 11th grade history. The time period is 1850 to 1948. And it's in this time period that the market economy accelerates and expands rapidly, very intensely, and eventually triumphs all over the world. We study also in this time period the fragmentation of life, how the more holistic, pre-modern, traditional societies, you know, they start to fragment, and you get an increasing distance, or the beginning of a distance between the economic and the cultural or moral, as Todd mentioned already, between work and leisure, between public and private, between family and community. On the other hand, there are these consolidating forces that are taking place. This is when Europe expands all over the world through imperialism. There's access to raw materials, to labor, to markets. The second industrial revolution brings new technologies for distribution, for production. The railroads invented in this time period, electricity, internal combustion engine, all kinds of communications technologies. So you really get this market economy that spans the globe. This is also when there's a great shift to a consumer-driven economy, because production and distribution capacities are so seemingly unlimited. So this is when modern advertising is born, because you got to stimulate consumer demand. This is also when you get innovations like the efficiency movements, Taylorism, the gap between utilitarianism and preservationism was already mentioned. Utilitarianism, scientific management, I already said. So there, anyway, my point is there's this leap in production and distribution capacities, this giant consumer-driven economy that by the 1920s has created this great global web of interconnected activity that emerged. So you have plantation workers in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia that are developing rubber for cars that are made in Europe or in the United States, and you have cotton that's grown in Egypt or West Africa that's being produced into uniforms and textile factories that are making these uniforms for the car manufacturers, and you have copper that's coming from Chile that's going to the auto industry. And in the 1920s, everybody's buying cars, but when they stop buying cars, what happens? The whole system collapsed globally. And so you get You know, you get the bakers who are supplying the lunches to the miners in the Chilean copper mines, and they're also out of work and poor. And this collapse of this market economy that everybody recognizes in the Great Depression, and they try to figure it out. So you get the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and the complete, you know, supposedly restructuring of the economy. So you get these supranational institutions that are trying to manage the market economy in a new way. And that's where we are today. I mean, the Bretton Woods system is over, but there's still this effort to, you know, to kind of manage this global economy as it emerged in the time period, as it triumphed in the time period that I teach. The second reason I'm here, though, is because I've been involved in the social entrepreneurship community for about 10 to 12 years. And this is a kind of amorphous community. It's just taking, I mean, it's part of a movement for changing the economy, for not just changing the economy, but to change the way that we think about the economy. Some people call it conscious capitalism, some people call it ethical business, socially responsible business, corporate social responsibility. Some people are trying to even, you know, they think of the Aspen Institute has have you heard of the fourth sector that they're talking about in the Aspen Institute? And for lack of a better word, because it's really quite a new movement, I'm going to call it the new economy movement. Now, the new economy movement is based on this idea that there are really deep, profound problems in the current system, and that is a really old idea. I mean, that's as old as the market economy itself. But it's in the zeitgeist now as it never has been before. And there's this great proliferation of efforts to try to, quote, make, you know, capitalism better. Capitalism has a brand problem all over the world. Even Walmart and McDonald's know this. But what I am interested in for the purposes of teaching is that there's this great proliferation of efforts. Like I said, you can see it in academic literature. You can see it in the number of graduate schools that are offering socially responsible programming. You can see it in the number of, you know, think tanks and in the awards and the contests and the media coverage. That this is a movement that possibly its time has come. And it's, think about like the organic food movement like 25 or 30 years ago. It's something, you know, the practitioners or the activists like to think it's like that. And my experience with the social entrepreneurs is that they're hopeless optimists. They really, I mean, to be an entrepreneur, you have to be an optimist. So you spend time with people. I go to conferences, I go to workshops, and they're really deeply committed to the work they're doing, and they really think that this change is possible. As a teacher, that's really important. I like to bring it back to my students. I taught an elective on social entrepreneurship last year, and the students are really inspired. Most of the time, students just feel despair when they think about the state of the economy, when they think about the state of the world, for that matter. But this, you know, this movement, if, you know, I'm not sure it will succeed. It's you know, I'm hoping that it will, and a lot of people I talk to think, are convinced that it will, but it's still very new. It hasn't even really been, in my opinion, articulated super clearly. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of people doing good stuff, but conceptually, it's still a little bit, you know, fuzzy. You get arguments about actually what social entrepreneurship is. People talk about, and Todd and I discussed this the other day, it's kind of weird that you have to, you know, you have to distinguish between entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs. Like, when did that happen, right? Like, the whole entrepreneurial enterprise should be social to serve what the activists call the triple bottom line, which is returns, not just financial returns, but also environmental returns and social returns. And it's a really difficult challenge. There's all kinds of challenges. There's, you know, the problem of greenwashing, which hopefully you guys all know what that is. There's a problem of metrics. How do you actually measure environmental and social returns? And there are people that are out there that are really, really trying to make this happen. And the reason I mentioned Aspen Institute particularly is because they're arguing that, well, arguing is the wrong word. They're positing that there's this fourth sector that doesn't have a real space in our economic system yet, but it's not for profit, it's not government, and it's not nonprofit. It's a space where there are these hybrid activities taking place, and they don't have the institutional structures like, you know, access to financial markets or training or, you know, policy that supports them. But there's a lot of really, really good and interesting stuff that's happening in this field, in this movement, and that's the second reason that I'm here.
As you can see, we have a wide range of ideas and experiences here, and we're going to end our introductions with Ralph.
Well, Kurt Fisher, remember, he described learning as a sequence of plateaus and spurts. Spurt as in growth spurt. And plateaus and spurts is characteristic behavior of a complex dynamical system. So if we study complex dynamical systems, then we get an economy of learning, concepts that apply equally to the economic system, to pedagogical system, to biological system, to the solar system, and so on. So the evolution of computer languages, computer programming, has also proceeded in plateaus and spurts. So one spurt, for example, object-oriented programming. Between the C programming language and the C++ programming language, there is a significant leap in cognitive strategies. So it's not just a different language. You do not translate from C to C++. It's a completely different programming philosophy and much greater power in modeling natural systems because of this evolution of languages. The most recent spurt in the growth of computer programming languages is called agent-based modeling. This took place only about 10 years ago. And agent-based modeling makes it easy for anyone without extensive training in computer science to build models in natural domains, in the physical sciences, the biological sciences, the social sciences. Any teacher or researcher can build a model for their data using this technology, agent-based modeling that includes the most basic concepts of complex dynamical systems, which you've heard mentioned or implied in the presentations of my 4 co-panelists. So it's important that, in order to understand trade or economics, to obtain basic concepts of complex dynamical systems, a branch of mathematics. I think I've been speaking long enough, I can mention that word. Because this empowers us to model our data, to model our concepts, to construct models which are little animations that can be utilized effectively in kindergarten. And also, the study of complex dynamical systems evolves about 1 million times faster with mathematical models and computer simulation than it could in the study of natural systems through the data and eyeball inspection and hand-drawn graphs and so on. So from my perspective as a professor of complex dynamical systems, each student graduating from the Ross School should have working knowledge, effective skill with complex dynamical thinking based on extensive experience with models, for example, written in NetLogo is a language I usually teach agent-based modeling with, as I did here in the Ross School, partnering with Gary Skellington some 3-4 years ago. Well, the advantage of going last in a panel is that there is an excuse, a time imperative to cover up laziness. So I think it's time to go on to our next phase.
Much appreciated. And you did save time doing that, so that's actually great. We're right back on target, almost. In Bill's narrative thread on trade and cultural development, he posits the following, and I want to start with this question because I think it ties together a lot of the pieces that we've sort of thrown out on the floor here, and we need to massage back into a complex dynamical system and discussion. He posits the following: the emergence of the human I is really an expression of an us in which individuals emerge in linguistic cultures. So the question for us then is, what are the roles of the I and the us in our narrative thread regarding trade and economics? And I know we've already sort of begun this discussion, and certainly Ken alluded to it, but any of the panelists who would like to sort of jump in on this first, thinking about this I and us in our narrative thread as it proceeds through our curriculum.
Well, the primary bond is the teacher and the student. So this is like the mother and the infant in Wordsworth's poetry. So we begin not with the building, because we all recognize that you're more important than the buildings. These can be replaced, but you can't, because whatever you're unique individuals, and when you're replaced, it's going to be a very different person in the collective emergent domain, and raw school changes every year. So if we start with the basic exchange of teacher and student and are sensitive to all the dimensions of that, then that's, I think, a healthy beginning.
Yeah. I'd just like to sort of second that, because, you know, in thinking about what it is an exchange, anthropologists think about exchange as a sort of fundamental element of the human condition, in that one of the ways that we reach outside of our sort of existential I towards the others through the exchange. And it could be through the exchange of ideas, it could be through the exchange of a glance, it could be through the exchange of material goods or food, but that ability to reach outside of ourselves is enabled in large part through the exchange of various things. And for the most part, those exchanges are reciprocal exchanges. That is, that they're morally based on the idea that you give as well as receive. And I think that's something to really kind of try and wrap your head around. In the March, this most recent year, in March of Science, there's a really interesting study that said that in foraging societies, and they studied something like 35 of them, that innovation usually increases, and this is a no-brainer, people like Bill and Ralph, but innovation usually increases with the complexity of the group and the larger group size. And one of the ways throughout history, I mean, for most of human history, we've lived in small, under 150, population size groups. The only way that they can increase that innovation is through exchanging with other groups, whether that be exchanging women, or exchanging axes, or exchanging something that really increased the network, right? The network was really based on the exchange, and trade I subsume under this idea of exchange, but sort of the exchange of different types of things. So really that, the enlargement of the I really does come from, that network, that in large part has been based on exchange.
Good.
It's great to hear. Thank you. So many concepts of complex dynamical systems theory utilized correctly. The complex dynamical system has a kind of a substrate, which is a graph or a thing where you visualize nodes or points or little balls like Legos stuck together with sticks. And like communities exchange goods, like in Tibet I saw salt coming this way and rice going that way, along these trade routes. Or so the substrate of the complex dynamical system is this grid or network or matrix. And then the dynamic, the action of it, are the goods traded or things, information passing from node to node. Also, in nature and in mathematical models, we see these grids evolving. You could think of the length of the sticks changing. so that the geometry of the nodes or knobs changes. And it's the tendency in the abstract of these systems to evolve into a kind of a hierarchical structure where you have a clump of nodes that are like closer together, and then superhighways or meta pathways connecting clump to clump. The clumps are called cliques in the jargon of graph theory. So the clump, inside a clump, is a complex dynamical system that has nodes and links. Each of those nodes is a clump which contains, and so on. We see this kind of evolution in social systems and economic systems, and as Todd was describing. So these concepts are more and more emerging into the discourse of scholars of the social sciences because agent-based modeling has allowed people to experience the concepts in action in the computer simulations, and therefore grok them easily. So this is a pedagogic process going on among professionals who are writing articles published in professional journals and so on. And it's the same in the school system, such as the Ross School. If we want our students to obtain these concepts, then they have to have the experience of them in model systems running on computers and so on.
Ken, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, thinking back again to the study of economics per se, and I was trying to think how I would teach economics to children in a way that would be meaningful. And I know when I first studied economics as a discipline, most of you who have studied economics know that usually it begins with microeconomics and moves on to macroeconomics. So it starts at the level of the individual, then groups of individuals, et cetera, moves upwards. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was that I remember we were taught the concept of utils, what was useful for the people. You'd have some people derive more utils than others from different things. And how people make individual decisions and choices based on who they are, their needs. We sort of oodles of utils, right? And things just as, even when you talk about concepts like elasticity of demand, I think some of you would know that, a heroin addict has very different elasticity of demand for heroin than I do. You know, these things are at the individual level. If you understand the individual level of these theories, it helps to begin to understand why people don't seem rational, although I think actually they are in many ways, given who they are and what their needs are. That begins to bring it upwards. And all of these things go back to issues like sociology, psychology, why people make the choices they do. And this even goes into things like status and class, which we'll talk about later on. Someone who makes a very public donation, and that's the kind of the potlatch. You know, I'm raising my status, therefore I will have more. These are investments. I think all of these decisions are economic, and there is an economic thread to them that goes back to even how children see the world, you know, why they make the decisions. So I think it can begin on the I level, moving up then to, but there is no I. It's always an us in anything that's social. We are by far the most social primate. We're like, I think of us as like an anthill among the primates. And I think that has to inform. Just one last thing I want to say about that is that in this country, of any country I've ever lived in, there is an enormous myth of individualism. This country loves Horatio Alger and I can do it myself, blah, blah, blah. That is a theme in the United States, in our mythologies, that is something we have to talk about as educators, as humans. And I mean, I remember my realization of this was looking at some black helicopter guy in Montana who was extremely right-wing and off the grid. And then, of course, when his kid, and hated the government, his kid has kidney nephritis, and he's at the hospital looking for help. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, why don't you go out and figure out how to take out a kidney, go out and find the metals for the scalpel and do it yourself. You know what I mean? You know, you're off the grid. None of us are off the grid. And the grid has gotten so complex with specialization, with the internet, with the flattening of, and this is where we go to Ralph's area, where that grid is beyond the Neolithic mind that we carry around, that we can conceive of. And I think that's where the problem lies. No one quite understands this new grid that we're all interconnected with. But it is something that can be a theme that can go through childhood education, how that works from the lowest level up, decision-making and choices.
You know, it's a very interesting point because I find that sort of evolutionary process and whether or not we can actually understand and live in the grid, live in that complex dynamical system, whether it's something that we do here and how we do it and whether we do it well or not. And as the new guy, I can ask that question, so I'm fortunate to be in that position. Is what we do, is the context in the way we teach it, is the context in the way we teach trade and economics leading people to a much better understanding of complex dynamical systems? More complicated question than we originally were faced with, I guess.
I think it relates to the age level appropriateness of the development of the stages of consciousness of the child. So it used to be with children in markets that they exchanged baseball cards and marbles when I was a kid in Chicago in the Second World War. Now they're at a higher level of abstraction. They're exchanging text messages in symbolic abbreviated code that's not even, you know, English anymore. So that means that if we take what Kurt said, which I was glad to see is isomorphic to the design of the spiral, because his growth in spurts and three-level form is the triad from my narrative of formative, dominant, and climactic. And then the cognitive maps he's talking about is our recapitulation at the end. So you're getting two distinctly different approaches, a kind of pedagogical expert concerned with the development of the brain and a narrative-based cultural historian, and we're coming up with similar structures. And there's a third structure coming from Ralph. So we're in an interesting time. So if we're dealing with kindergarten, the way we would deal with the elements at that level and the way we would deal with it in the 10th grade in Lavoisier and chemistry and things, there may be similar things, but we're not going to teach the kids chemistry. And so we'll teach economics when it emerges as part of the development in the 10th grade. For example, the very first chair of economics created at Oxford was held, and it was called the chair of moral theory. It wasn't called economics. Economics is a good word. It just means naming the home. But it was Nassau Senior, and at high table where they're all eating very well, he said, "The trouble with the Irish famine is not enough of them died." So George Trevelyan, the Secretary of the Exchequer, applied market theory to the distribution of the food and did not want to distribute corn in Ireland because it would shatter the economic market system of England, which was at that time going through a major conflict between protectionism of the corn laws to protect the agricultural economy of the Tories and the new triumphant liberals in global economics and free trade. So there was a collision of two classes, to introduce that word, and a collision of two cultures, Irish and English, and what happened was a catastrophe bifurcation. And we had the emergence of a new science and a million people starving to death. And of course that hasn't gone away. We have Somalia even as we speak. So how we approach it has to be very sensitive to everything we know about brain science and child psychology and child development. We can't take abstractions from one level and say, okay, we'll impose it here.
Well, this is, on the meta level, we have threads, okay, like trade in economics is a thread. And a thread means something you can string beads on. So in each grade, you might have an integrated unit or something which is a bead on this thread. An integrated unit might actually contact several different threads, so you have to think of threads going crisscrossing through all these different beads. Well, threads are made of fibers twisted together, so threads have threads. And in the trade and economic thread, we might think of a fiber called markets. And the market, participating in a market is a way to learn market and trade concepts through actual experience. And there could be age-appropriate examples of markets which are performed in the classroom from K through 12. including eventually, of course, computer simulated markets, such as those we now use in the field of experimental economics.
Yeah, show and tell is a market, you know, so it's built in our, you set up a market system where maybe it's exchange of who gets to dance or who gets to play or things of this sort. So there are very ways to perform the structure.
Go ahead.
Well, just to get back to the question of how do we sort of talk about some of these trade threads in more complex, dynamical ways. And I remember when I learned about the expansion of capitalism from Europe into other parts of the world, it was simply treated as sort of a linear system in which, you know, capital and goods of various forms from Europe arrived in some foreign shore, and people were amazed and automatically subsumed their own cultural system and economic system within that capitalist system. And it was a very sad tale, and, you know, seemed you know, not to bode well for anyone that wanted to study anthropology, because pretty much everyone just becomes a capitalist in that scenario. I think a more complex way of handling the emergence of capitalism is to, you know, maybe think about the world system as a function of relative cultural logics around the world. So the example that I like to think of is that in the late 1700s, Lord Macartney, right around the time when Adam Smith was writing his famous tract, Lord Macartney was sent by George III to the Qianlong Emperor, the Manchu Dynasty Emperor in China, to open up trade between Britain and China, because the British were sick of the Cantonese system. They wanted to get tea, which at that point they were addicted to, and they had been...
Elasticity of demand.
Right, well, exactly, inelastic demand. And it turns out that most of the major early commodities were, you know,
Drugs.
addictive substances.
Yes. Like oil.
Right, exactly. But you know, the only thing that the Chinese would accept from the British was silver, and of course, silver was coming from Potosi, and quickly, you know, the mercantilists were not very happy with the amount of silver that was being exchanged, and at horrible exchange rates, by the way. I mean, we were just sort of, or the British were unloading, you know, just their coffers of silver at an unbelievable rate. So Lord Macartney shows up in the, you know, at the throne room of the Son of Heaven, and he's, you know, sort of brings all the best manufactured wares from Britain, right? Cuckoo clocks and sterling silver, and just really, you know, amazing inventions that were supposed to be signs of the civilization of Britain, that the Chinese would automatically sort of say, you know, we'll take it, right? But there's a famous letter that was sent back from the emperor to the King of England, saying, thank you very much for sending these really nice little trinkets as a sign of your tribute and your turning towards civilization, right? Within a cultural logic that said that exchange was about, you know, was about subsuming oneself to the civilization that was embodied within the Emperor of China, right? That the emperor was the possibility for all forms of civilization. The only way that you could become civilized in that system was to, you know, sort of send little, you know, exotic gifts from your land to say that I now want to become part of that civilization. Mm-hmm. So the note basically said, thank you very much, but we're not really interested in your trinkets, and by the way, we invented most of them anyway. So, I mean, this became a real dilemma, and of course Carrie talks about this because it eventually leads up, you know, with the British turning towards opium that's grown in India and becomes, you know, the point of a war that breaks out. The Americans, of course, didn't have opium because they didn't have any colonies at that point. But what they did have was an exchange relationship with Hawaii, and so they were able to find one thing that the Hawaiians, or that the Chinese were willing to accept, and that was sandalwood. And so the Americans show up with all these expensive, you know, manufactured goods, and the Hawaiians love them. King Kamehameha I, I think, was just obsessed with, you know, wearing the finest, you know, British woolens and dining with, the most proper English tea sets, because in the Hawaiian cosmology, all things of value come from outside of the society, right? That come from beyond the islands and come from the realm of the gods. And so, I mean, the acceptance or rejection of, capital or goods or whatever is completely dependent on these relative cultural logics. And I say logic because I agree with Ken that, well, with very few exceptions, human beings are logical, they're rational, but it's not, I don't think it's the practical logic that Adam Smith was envisioning, but a cultural logic. And I think that cultural logic is what modern economists like Gary Becker at the University of Chicago are starting to turn towards, to see how can we capture those cultural logics rather than a universal practical logic with economic models and economic theory.
I want to add to that. One of the things why I feel strongly it's important to try to attack any social or political issue with logic and rationality is because so much the media and the world tends to see the things as good and bad and moralistic rather than really understanding underlying reasons, rationales for why things happen. And I think for educators, it's very important to look at the economic thread. I had an incident a couple of days ago with my son Darius, who's a total straight dude, loves to get on Netflix and look at police files, whatever. And he was watching this thing called Border Wars, which is about how the Americans keep the Mexicans out. And it was a very kind of Fox News type thing of like, how do we keep these evil Mexicans from crossing the border? And as a parent, I want to say, whoa, it's more complex than that. So he asked, why are they coming across? And we had a whole discussion about the economics of immigration. And we have very good friends who are Mexicans, many of whom are illegal. And talking about that, and the economic thread became very important in the discussion. And it goes on to larger issues. I mean, I work a lot in the Middle East, and I feel very strongly about the Iraq War, the Palestinian conflict. And I have seen how in my childhood, so many of these human conflicts were taught wrongly. I mean, the Civil War, for example, it's all about good guys in the North liberating blacks in the South. Hello, it was an economic conflict, and slavery had an economic component to it that's very important. I think looking at the history of African Americans, 500 years this group of people had their capital stolen from them, so it affects the feeling towards labor and work. These are all economic issues in every war and every conflict. World War II. It wasn't until I was much older looking at the spheres of influence. The good guys were the Anglo-British and Americans, and then these nasty Japanese came in, and well, they also wanted a piece of the pie. I didn't know until I was in my 50s that before Pearl Harbor, the US put an oil embargo on Japan, just the weeks before. I didn't know that. And that's when you think about the Arab-Israeli conflict and the fact the Israelis, these kind of preemptive, there are underlying reasons that people need to understand so that they don't say good guys, bad guys, black hats, white hats. Then they'll say, oh, there's something going on here. My big passion is the Middle East, as you know. And for me, there are so many underlying economic issues there. Obviously, the Iraq War, when people talk freedom and blah, 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 I don't even know where to begin. Because I really do know the history of Iran and Mossadegh and all of the economic reasons for US and British involvement in the region. And even the Arab-Israeli conflict. I took a course at Michigan when I was there called Hydropolitics of the Middle East. It was a fascinating course. It talked about the water resources between the Palestinians and Israelis, which has always been a big issue that's never discussed in the US papers. And at that time, this was in '79, the professor, now water is a key economic resource. And for those of you who are from desert regions know this. The course taught us how he predicted that the Israelis would give up the Sinai, hold on to the Golan, and take the West Bank. And everything he said, just based on water, everything he said came true. And I've never heard anyone talk about this, and yet that course was so revelatory to me in that it's not just about religion. There's many other levels to this. So every thread, every time you teach about a human conflict or human groups of human desires, there should be, wait a minute, what's going on at the economic level? What resources are here that people are talking about? Because then it becomes more rational. I mean, rational in a way that you're not talking about good and evil, which is the trap we fall into.
It's a complex rationality, isn't it?
One of the reasons I introduced the term into the curriculum essay, cultural ecology, is to reinforce that notion of the embeddedness of culture, because when you discuss a continental people where the center is the mandate from heaven, operating from a different kind of state of consciousness versus an island people where all value is coming from outside. These are two drastically different cultural ecologies affecting the state of consciousness. So this is why our curriculum is called an evolution of consciousness curriculum and not, you know, Western Civ or our emerging global world or whatever. So consciousness, and when I was at MIT in the 60s with the triumph of econometrics, down the street, Skinner was teaching that the mind doesn't exist, there's just output, input, and came up with whole kinds of theories of how to raise infants and not touch them, and that was imitated in, you know, as your friend's book on morals and economist talks about the horror of Romanian orphanages where the children are psychotic because they've never been touched or held or interacted with the I and the us again. So the first time I encountered a market in the border wars was in the 60s when I went down to Mexico to the Indian market of Toluca. And it was fascinating because all the Western, you know, hippie women were going down there buying male serapes or wearing male camisas de boda, wedding shirts, with no bras. And then you go in where the Indian women are, and there are all these lurid brasiers in pink and magenta and fuchsia, the best that the industrial world could, and they were really hot to get them. So it's like women were getting rid of their bras and the Indian women wanted bras, and it was like two different states of consciousness, you know. So when someone in the third world buys a Coke, he isn't just buying a Coke, he's buying into a sense of belonging that this is a planetization phenomenon, and you know, we are the world, and Coca-Colization. So states of consciousness are what underlie art, economics, physics, complex dynamical systems, and what we're trying to do is track the phenomenology by which those states of consciousness change over time, ending with the cognitive mapping of the conscious recapitulation that sums up everything they've done. But of course, people don't come to Ross at K and graduate at 12. They come in at grade 11 and, you know, it's all screwed up, but that's another story.
Great, an interesting series of questions indeed. I think we have time basically for one more positional question here, and then we can open it up.
Q&A, yeah.
And I wanted to actually finish with this idea of the emergence of a newly urbanized world. More than half of the population now lives in cities. Cities, by their very nature, are very complicated systems. And there's lots of conversation now about, in essence, cities acting as independent units, separate from national policy. They develop their own trading networks, their own trading patterns, their own intellectual networks, their own intellectual patterns. And basically, urban systems are creating a new matrix that's overlaid over the other sort of world systems that exist. It would be interesting to have Emanuel Wallerstein be able to talk about these things.
Yeah.
But I'm curious in terms of, you know, what we do here. What does this mean for the Ross curriculum? What does this mean for a potential transformation of the Ross curriculum? And perhaps what does this emerging consciousness, this urban consciousness, if you will, what does that mean for the rest of this world in a complex system? We can almost go back to an economic, you know, position of winners and losers. But I don't want to necessarily lead us in that direction. So I'm curious what the thoughts are about this newly urbanizing position that we're in.
I'll jump in because I think I would agree that this is too dyadic, like good and evil of urban. What's happening is like think biologically, like the evolution of the cell with a nucleus. Certain agricultural processes are getting miniaturized and internalized as the mitochondria were producing the oxygens. Think of the mitochondria as kind of farms, and all the information is being concentrated in the nucleus to create sexual reproduction, which accelerates time because every generation is different. So it isn't that we're all becoming urban, it's that we're going to create ecological design systems of rivens of biological living systems. There's a book by my colleague John Todd called Eco-Cities and Bioshelters. And so Paul Mankiewicz in the Bronx in New York has designed moss-covered walls for the cathedral to replace air conditioning and rivers of parks going through and reclaiming the rivers around New York. So it's a process of miniaturization, not the Los Angelesization of the planet. That'll go into crisis, implode, and be dysfunctional. So I don't think we want to think in terms of either or. And if we've studied the anthropological basis, say in grade 11 with visionary revolts and global consolidation, then we'll understand what's going on in politics in America, because what unites Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, and Governor Perry is they're all small town, what I would say is a Chicago, New York, or LA kid, Hicks. This is small town versus the metropole of the coast. And so all the values are kind of 19th century small town white Protestant values. But we live in an America of Latinos, Catholics, Jews. We're much more complicated than that. This is a nativistic movement. It's indigenous to America, like the Know Nothing Party. And all during the industrialization, you had nativistic movements, which is why we study the Taiping Rebellion. And then we see Emmanuel Zapata with peasants, and Patrick Pearse in Ireland, and Castro and Mao Zedong with peasants. But were we becoming a planet of peasants? No way. And even China, did it go that way? No. So we don't want to think dyadically. That's the wrong model.
Go ahead,
Well,
Carrie,
this,
Go for it. Okay, Ralph, then Carrie? Carrie, then Ralph?
let me,
Carrie.
give me just a minute and I'll introduce Carrie's comment.
Read her mind.
I just wanted to point out that the current urban revolution, which falls in Carrie's mentality of grade 11, is not the first one, and there was a really big one 5,000 years ago that it comes in, is at grade 5. That one, the urban revolution of 5,000 years ago, was precipitated by the development of the wheel, especially the cart wheel, that facilitated the transfer of groceries from the farm to the urban center. And our current urban revolution is also precipitated by a radical change, a catastrophic change in the network structure precipitated by the internet, the World Wide Web, cyberspace, and so on. Radical change in the bandwidth, the capacity of the trade channels that carry culture between centers.
That's connected to what I was going to say. Thank you for the introduction. About 10 years ago, maybe, I was in New York. I was in Central Park waiting in line, I think, for the zoo. And I noticed that when I looked in the line, very few of the young people that I saw were white. There's a great cultural mixing going on there, and they were all together and chatting and mixing in a way that, unfortunately, sometimes doesn't happen at the school. But I was struck just by how multicultural New York is, and tons of cities all over the world. And I was thinking about how in my grade's curriculum we focus on particular cities, like for instance Paris, where there's this convergence of all of these folks and ideas and certain technologies and architecture that allowed this thriving of of culture. And when I thought about New York that day, I thought about this happening in cities not just all over America, but all over the world, and how, just like Paris in the late 19th century, there's this this on the internet, this single urban city where people in cities, kids I was thinking about because they're so savvy with the tech, that there's this possibility, and I think reality in some cases, of kids, young people who are that media savvy and older people who are interested of communicating in this single sort of, abstract urban environment. Because outside of the cities, fewer people, it seems, certainly in other places in the world, have access to those media tools. But I just thought it was a really interesting way to conceptualize today's urbanity. Like, is it like one big mega city connected by all of these different media nodes? And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. I want to go back to what Ken said about the Civil War. I teach the Civil War as a Southern nationalist movement because I teach nationalism in my time period. And it was definitely about economics. It's really you said, it's really an economic argument. And one of the things that I have the students do is look at various explanations for the underlying causes, ideological, cultural, economic. and then finally slavery as the catalyst. And what we discover as we move through these documents is that slavery really is, coloring all of these other three things, the economics of it, the cultural, and the ideological arguments that went on in the Civil War. But slavery is a very economic, obviously it's about economics. So, but the point I want to make is that when we look at this Civil War and various other wars, there's this really great interweaving of all of them. They're all really, really deeply interwoven, even as you also mentioned Asia and World War II. When the Japanese were expanding, they were looking for resources, but they were also trying to create what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and remove the imperialists. When they arrived in the lands that they conquered, they declared themselves, liberators, because the Europeans and the Americans had colonized
like
there.
us in Iraq.
Very, very good. Okay,
And
that's
on
it.
that note,
Actually,
Yeah.
can I just add a
Go
thought
ahead.
to that?
Yes,
Before
we'll turn to
coming
the
here, I was
crowd.
thinking about economic concepts I think that kids should have by the time they get up, supply and demand, competitive advantage. But there are a few that really relate to this topic that I think are very important to think about. One is the concentration of wealth, and I know, Deborah, you sent out that wonderful pie chart. I think this is a huge and growing issue. The flattening of the world has both created enormous possibilities and growth, but it also has tended to exaggerate the concentration of that wealth. And I see this, for example, in the Middle East. Many of us have done a lot of good at making financial systems healthier and better, and I do believe that's a good thing. But if it's not counterbalanced by some sharing of the wealth, what happens is the gap of the head, the criminal in the head of the Tunisian government before was just 5 times the working class. It becomes 3,000 times. And part of what happened in the Middle East is that huge separation between the nouveau riche in Egypt and Yemen and Tunisia and the underemployed underclass, which are very much economic things, plus the growth of populations and the lack of housing. These are real economic issues that were behind. I have been under martial law so many times in my life I can't tell you. And the reason is because I tend to go to financial systems when they're in trouble, and that's usually, guess what, aligned with political crises and everywhere you go. So I think concentration of wealth, both globally and locally, and in Sag Harbor, and this is a topic that is simply taboo in the United States. No. It's like the emperor has no clothes. People don't talk about it because of our mythology. It hits us at this greatest mythology on the level of a classless society. I think it should be from the beginning, from very early stages, because concentration of wealth means concentration of power, and that's part of the reason that most Americans don't vote. So it really does, I think that's a big issue. The other issue, I think, is questions of monopolies. That's a related issue, and that I can go on and on about that. But one of the separate related is the tension between the public and private sector. This is an issue I work a lot with overseas in financial systems. I feel very strongly that one of the reasons the financial system collapsed in the U.S. was because of lack of regulation. That government does play a role. That there is a role for government. But government is also monopoly, so it doesn't do things as efficiently as the private sector. When people talked about the end of history when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was such a naive take, because yes, communism was probably not the best mechanism to resolve this crisis, but that tension is so still with us. And I think even children, when I look at Sag Harbor and their decision to asphalt all the streets but not put in a damn sidewalk, that's a public policy decision that is real and affects my kids' ability to bike or walk to school, which is something I feel very strongly about, by the way. And I think that on the very lowest level, kids can understand this and say, why did they decide to do this and not this? Who made them make that decision? These are real issues. The last issue I think is very important to understand in economics is externalities. We mentioned this yesterday. I think that I remember when I was at Wharton and taking the supply and demand and asking questions, wait a minute, this is assuming equal, and which is, of course, as you know well, is not the case. And one of my revelations was when I began to learn about the concept of externalities in economics, and very, very simply put, I remember explained to me, factory A is making widgets, factory B is making widgets. Widgets are what you make in business school. And you need pure, clean water to make the widgets, and factory A can make the widgets for $20, but they have to pollute the water to do so, and that's an externality. It's an external good that they're not costing. So downstream, factory B has to pay $4 to clean the water so they can pure it. That $4 is an externality. Very simple concept, but you know what? So many public policy people don't think about it. And I feel so strongly that if oil were priced, including the externalities of global warming, of the net present value of all the problems we're going to have, of the Iraq war, of blah, 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 it would be at least 3 times what we pay in the United States. And I think that debate has to be understood by the youngest kids. So when their parents drive giant SUVs, not that they're ashamed or whatever, but at least they say, wait a minute, maybe we can do this better in our generation. You know, maybe we can price this better because we understand the externalities, both, you know, in a spiritual level, but also in an economic level, to capture those things that are not captured. So I think those are 3 concepts that are really fundamental, that can start at early ages and that help them with their debate going on.
On that subject, I want to add that one of the things that I want kids to understand when they leave the school is that, you know, and again, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish, but there is a movement of organizations and people and activists who are trying to actually eliminate externalities. There are no such thing. And we've talked about this in our, that you have to factor in what they call the triple bottom line or people, planet, profits, and the, you know, there are real solutions being discussed, like in 5 states, or maybe it's 4 states now, you can incorporate you can incorporate or change your bylaws and become what's called a certified benefit or B corporation, in which you are not obligated to just maximize returns to shareholders.
Right.
You can actually, you know, you can make decisions that are not based on the financial bottom line without fear of a lawsuit. Right. So if you go to Vermont and you look at King Arthur Flower's mission statement, one of their statements is, making money is not our highest priority. And they can say that. And this is on the books in 4 or 5 states, and there's another half dozen states that are trying to get these laws passed. There's like real, you know, policy solution or attempted solutions. Again, it's a new movement, or relatively new compared to how movements go. But there, you know, but the idea of externalities is one even that's in question. Yes. And it's not just about like people who want to volunteer or donate or perform charitable services.
Can I add just something Carrie said? A lot of the work I've done in the last 15 years has been with development banks, China Development Bank, Mexico, Saudi. And this is a big issue for the World Bank and others, is what is the economic return of an investment rather than the financial return? Because the two are different. If you're investing in female literacy, the return on that might not show up for 20 years. Well, how the hell do you measure it? And this is a big
That's
question.
A big thing, but they're also trying to come up with metric solutions.
Exactly, and I think that's something even for kids to think about, is how do you measure these issues? Because if you're going to be rational and make public policy decisions, you have to have some thought about how do you measure the return on your investment. These are real issues, and I think you can think about them early on, because if people are going to vote, they have to understand these issues when they grow up and be part of the process. Anyway, go on.
Appreciate you adding those pieces in, Ken, because I think they're great question generators, clearly. We're going to move to the audience for questions. Raise your hand. Mike will come over, and you're on. So Jen, I think, hold on.
I was just thinking of something.
Jen got it, then Gary.
Is this working?
Yeah.
I don't know if the panel knows about a project that's been going on here for a couple of years called the Zim Kids. Carrie, you're probably familiar with that. Chris Engel brought it here. There's an American artist who went to Zimbabwe and worked in the village with kids, and they made these little dolls, really cool dolls. And he brings them here, and they sell them for $25 each. They sold some this summer. And it's been going on for about 5 years. And what happens with the money, the kids take a picture of themselves holding the doll that they bought. They get a picture of the kid who made it and learn something about that child. But the money doesn't go to the individual doll maker. It goes back to kind of a collective, where the money is then spent for books, uniforms, a variety of things. And I just think that could be an interesting thing for the students to follow up, not just learn about the individual maker of their doll, but learn what happens to the money when it goes back to this community. Because I'm not even sure exactly what happens, but that could be an interesting thing for them to, to learn about.
Sorry, just very specific, but actually Dennis did come to the lower school last year and show slides of actually how the money's being spent, where it goes. We also were lucky enough to Skype in with the kids and talk to them about it, so that was great.
Hi guys, I have a sort of question, and you've hit on it a little bit, but I don't even know exactly how to frame it. It's me. It's right here, Will. the rise of the corporation as an individual also happens, and this takes place, and then it has rights now, but little responsibilities. From at least maybe I'm totally wrong on that. I'm not sure. And then it was formed in a nation state. Now it has become a globalized, planetized actual organism, and several of them have occurred, and hundreds of them now work around and are designed purposely and basically to be amoral, have no moral consciousness for these large individuals. The us became I, and then now are working around the world, and now come back to a political or social structure to where they transfer monetary wealth for political movement. And therefore, that's what's happened in our culture, and it's also happening in other ones. So like that's why you get the MCAA and the DMC, all those different rules that all of a sudden they're just popping up about copyright law that was from here. Now all of a sudden it's in Europe. They're trying to force the same issue. How does that affect the world when you create organisms that are not for the people, only for the individual, that act amorally, that are, I don't know how to explain where I'm going at. Sorry, I'm proselytizing a little bit, but I don't know. What does that mean when they do that? Or where does it go?
Well, I think Ken's right. It's a question of language, because if your value system is I-based, then if you can get the Supreme Court to recognize the corporation as an individual, that has political power in our culture. That's not part of the narrative in other cultures, but it gives them an enormous kind of clout they didn't have before. The difficulty with the language of externalities is it seems like it's something out there that you can sort of ignore as you focus on here. Margaret Mead, a colleague in my Lindisfarne Association, is Amory Lovins, who wrote a classic paper called Soft Energy Paths about the oil crisis way back in the 70s. And Margaret Mead told him, he said, "You'll never get it through an American Senate if you call it soft energy paths," you know. And when the Nobel laureate was here, Leon Edelman at Courtney's, he was depressed that Congress had voted down not just the East-West Center that Courtney talked about yesterday, but voted down the Batavia, Illinois, linear accelerator, and the World Center shifted to Geneva. And it's called the Hadron Linear Circular Accelerator. And I said, well, if you called it or he said rather, we're talking back and forth, he said if we called it the hard-on accelerator, it would have got through the Senate. So language is extremely important in creating imaginations. Benjamin Lee Whorf studied this years ago when he saw signs that said empty barrels, but they were gasoline barrels. They were more dangerous empty than they were filled. So language creates this state space that has enormous political implications. Well, go ahead. I don't want to. You know me. I can just go on. At any rate, part of what's happening is there's what I call the directorate. The board of directors is now planetary, and it might be, a caliph or sheikh from Saudi Arabia, Japanese and Chinese businessman, and an American oil man, a David Koch type. There's no commitment to nationalism. They'll make decisions. Well, we're moving all our production to China, Walmart's decision. And suddenly, they don't, the working class is not part of their consciousness. And then you get the union busting thing in Wisconsin. So when there's that concentration, they're dealing with an old phenomenon of trickle down. We were watching Ralph's movie on PBS last night, in which Ralph and his colleagues are talking about complex dynamical systems and chaos. They roll the credits, and the credits are David Koch. And Koch and the Koch brothers financed the whole radical right movement, and they pollute externalities and give a lot of people cancer. What's their response to that? To create the Koch Cancer Center at MIT to molecular cures, where they're giving more people cancer than they'll ever cure at MIT. But that's the old mentality, and it's structures of consciousness. We have to learn to think in a new way. This is what we're trying to do at Ross, is get kids from K through 12 and hopefully, make a change.
I just want to say, Annie Leonard made a movie, one of her little activist movies about that concept of corporate personhood. Have any of you seen it? The corporation, yeah. And within the movement for change, a legislative solution is what people are looking for, to remove that protection from corporations, which is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment in this country, FYI.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, in that I think your concern is very valid. I think part of the problem, though, is that these corporations are not designed to be amoral. They're designed to, produce wealth for shareholders. The way that I see the problem is that the economic model that's developed from Adam Smith in 1776 has been divorced from moral issues, and intentionally so. And the idea is that businessmen do business, right? They're not in the business of morality, right? And so there's been a lot of, bad stuff that corporations have done, but no, they're, in a sense, they can be blameless because they're not in the business of, making people happy or giving people, better livelihoods or whatever. They're in the business of making money, making a profit for the shareholders. And so, I think there is this historical moment when the whole field of economics is developed as an attempt to make the study of economic behavior, which used to be part of morality and part of political economy or part of politics, as kind of a Newtonian science that's separated out from those things and can be studied mathematically, a mathematical kind of cold calculation of how do we make the most money for shareholders, and that's seen as a goal until we have social entrepreneurs who finally bring back in the idea of this triple bottom line and the embeddedness of corporations and other business within larger moral structures.
I'd like to say a word in defense of mathematics. Bill has mentioned this book, Markets and Morals, by Dan Friedman, who's my research partner in Santa Cruz. He's a mathematical economist, and his work is particularly aimed at emphasizing the essential role of morals in the success of markets, and his experimental and mathematical research is devoted to this idea.
To add to that, you said that corporations are not responsible to people, but they are. As you said, they're responsible to shareholders. And having worked in the business world for a long time, I'm very conscious of that. And I think one of the issues is that the pressure on Wall Street of constantly making a return does divorce from any kind of long-term impact. There's also a term issue. I remember once in Smith Barney, a bond trader, saying to me that human beings are not capable of thinking beyond 2 years. That's kind of the capacity. But our impacts are now much, much longer. I mean, look at Japan and radiation and everything else. And I think part of it is that goes back to that public-private tension. In a democracy, at least theoretically, those of us who vote can be the moral consciousness of saying these externalities have to be corrected. There was a great article in the New York Times a few days ago about corporations and children. Obviously, corporations, and I've been in the corporate world, you tend to mythologize a lot of what you're doing, and you go into denial mode. I mean, I don't think Dick Cheney is an evil person. I don't believe that, as my spouse does. I think he was someone who really believes within his context that he was doing the right thing because he's seen the benefits he's derived from it. But I think that when corporations begin to sell things to children that are ultimately nasty, and again, in the longer term, whether it's ADD drugs or television products, then it's our responsibility. And I think that the kids need to understand that. How do corporations work? How does shareholding work? Who owns the shares? What drives their decision making? And then the dysfunction of that. And again, I think it's mainly a good thing. I believe it's mainly a good thing. I am a capitalist. Mm-hmm. But I think the dysfunctions of that need to be understood, even at the middle school level, to say then the counterbalance is the longer term. And some of this becomes spiritual. In the Muslim world, there's a very strong movement that I'm I work with on Islamic finance. And a lot of Muslims are trying to make finance that incorporates the social responsibility in ways that they understand. I unfortunately feel that religion is going backwards, is not going to be a universal solution, but something else has to come that's spiritual, that says there is something bigger, there is something larger, there's something longer term, and those of us who are responsible citizens need to impose that on the normal and acceptable greed of the shareholder. But then we have to vote, don't we? So the Supreme Court justices are in power who do not make such decisions. And that's a civic lesson that starts very young.
I just want to say one more thing. I'm sorry, this is my second time on this question, but
This is your last word.
okay.
And the last word.
one of the things, I think it's fourth sector, but I'm not sure. They are trying to, they're trying to reimagine this whole thing, and I don't know if you can actually, if you're shifting consciousness when you're actually conscious of the fact that you're shifting the consciousness, but they don't. They're trying to imagine a way of working through this when you don't have shareholders making decisions. What you have is what is stakeholders. So shifts from shareholders to stakeholders in the decision-making process about corporate behavior. Just want to put that out there.
In Tunisia, I'm working with a sovereign fund, setting up the post-Tunisian government, and what we're trying to do in the sovereign fund is have shareholders and stakeholders who are union representatives, and the Europeans are more involved with it, in this. A lot of the French banks have stakeholder structures as well as shareholders.
Oh,
so
good.
Governance is a big issue. You mentioned you studied governance. Agency theory, who represents, how things are structured at the top. That's not just political, but it goes down at the economic structure. That's something that should be studied, governance. It's a very important part of how things function and why they function well or not.
And unfortunately, that will be the last word for now because we are out of time. We're going to have a commercial break. I want to thank everyone for participating. I thought it was very interesting.